Alright guys, welcome back to the channel, it's Maddie here, and today we are taking a look at what might be the best deck in Pokemon TCG Pocket, the new best deck, which is actually a fire deck focused around Moltres EX, Charizard EX, and Arcanine EX. That's right, everything wrapped up all into one deck list. This particular deck took the community by storm after it finished top place at 2 large online tournaments. Now, what's interesting about this deck specifically is unlike other Charizard decks from the past, this deck actually focuses on using both Charizard EX and Arcanine EX as the main attacking options. This deck takes the powerful endgame board setup that we're all accustomed to with Charizard and combines it with the faster paced, more consistent early damage that Arcanine provides. This ideally gives us the best of both worlds and gives us viable strategies against more matchups than if we were to run just Charizard or Arcanine on their own. Alright, now that all sounds great in theory, but let's go play some games and talk a little bit more about this deck. By the way guys, if you're watching this video, you're probably not subscribed to the channel, so if you're liking the videos and you want to stay tuned for more videos that I'll be uploading in the future, please go subscribe. I would really appreciate it. It means a lot to me and it's going to help the channel a lot. Alright, back to the video. Alright, now let's get into some matches and we'll talk a little bit more about this fire type deck. Now it's interesting, when I was playing games on the ladder to record some gameplay to make this video, what I actually found was that every single person I played against, sort of on the online random matches within Pokemon TCG Pocket, was basically all playing water type decks, and this is very interesting, but what it told me was that people are taking this new fire type deck very seriously. It is very popular right now, especially in the online tournaments, but I think it's very popular just in online play at the moment, and people are probably trying to counteract that to some degree by playing water type decks. But the two the two matches that I was able to find for this video were both going to be against a Venusaur deck and against a Blastoise deck, so I think that was kind of fitting playing Charizard. Now in both of those matchups, we didn't really get to utilize Arcanine a lot, but we'll talk about why we're running Arcanine in the deck in a little bit. But let's go ahead and take a look at the deck list. So this deck is running very heavy, count of Pokemon, right? We have 2 Charmeleon, 2 Charmander, and 2 Charizard, right? So the 2/2 line for the Charizard, and that's a lot of Pokemon in any deck, just to be sort of setting up one Pokemon, right, as the Charizard EX. So 6 Pokemon just in there for Charizard. Charizard is still going to be sort of the bread and butter because Charizard in its own right is the most powerful card in Pokemon TCG Pocket. If you don't know what Charizard does, it attacks for 200 damage, which is enough to KO any Pokemon right now in Pokemon TCG Pocket. It takes 4 energies, but when you use that attack, you discard 2 energies. The way that Charizard typically works is that you set this card up over 3 or 4 turns of using Moltres EX. And Moltres attack Inferno Dance allows you for 1 energy to flip 3 coins, and for how many heads that you're able to flip, you're able to attach a fire energy to your benched fire type Pokemon in any way that you'd like. And this is a very, very powerful card. In fact, Moltres might be the best card at accelerating energies in the entire game. Moltres has 140 HP and it does have an attack that does 70 damage for 3 energies, which isn't a terrible attack. This deck is a little bit spoiled for energies, and especially in the mid to late game, so it's not a terrible attack. If it does seem not great, but the fact that it's able to accelerate energy so quickly is definitely makes this attack not too terrible. But 140 HP, and the thing with Moltres, unlike all the other fire type cards in this deck, is that you're actually weak to electric type. You're not weak to water, and this can make things a little bit interesting in the Pikachu matchup, which is why Charizard in particular struggled against Pikachu, because Moltres being weak to electric type and Pikachu being sort of the most fast, most consistent deck in Pokemon TCG Pocket, Charizard had a tough matchup because you were just kind of getting, hit for too much damage early in the game, and you really weren't able to set up super consistently with the Charizard deck, which is, I think, a big reason why Arcanine is really good in this matchup. But again, we'll get to that in a little bit. So, yep, 2 Charmander, 2 Charmeleon, 2 Charizard, and 2 Moltres. So right now we have 4 basic Pokemon, and then as you see here, 1 Growlithe with 2 Arcanine EX. Now this is an interesting concept, and we'll get into this right now. So the reason why we're not running 2 Growlithe and 2 Arcanine, or the reason why we're not running 2 Growlithe when we're running 2 Arcanine, is because we want to be able to find the cards that we need in the deck off of Pokeball. Pokeball grabs a random basic Pokemon from your deck and puts it into your hand. Now if you start basically with a Moltres or a Charmander, yes, of course, you don't really mind if you pull any of them with the Pokeball, but the thing with Growlithe is it's not a card that you necessarily want to start with to any degree, right? Arcanine only takes 3 energies, so you can kind of get it set up really early. You would rather start with a Charmander so you could start attaching to it, or preferably you would rather start with the Moltres in your hand because that's the card you want to start in the active spot, because that is the card that you're going to use to accelerate energies throughout the game. So basically we're running only 1 Growlithe because we don't want it to start with it. as often as we do with Charmander or especially Moltres, because that's exactly why we're going to run 2 Moltres in the deck. You're not really always going to use 2 Moltres in a match, but sometimes it does come up. But for the most part, you really only need 1 Moltres, but the reason why we run 2 is because it is the best card to start with in our deck, so we want to increase the odds of which, we're starting with Moltres or drawing Moltres off of Pokeball. So that's why we're only running 1 Growlithe. A lot of matchups don't really require you to play Arcanine. It's sort of just there as a backup option, mainly against some of the faster paced sort of mid-range decks like Pikachu or maybe the Blaine's deck, or even sort of some of those fighting type decks like Marowak that are a little faster paced, right? Anything like Mewtwo or Venusaur or Blastoise or any, deck that kind of thrives in the late game, you're going to be, investing in Charizard rather than Arcanine. So that's why we're only running 1 Growlithe while we're running 2 Arcanine EX. A lot of Pokemon in this deck for sure. I mean, we're running 11 total Pokemon, which means that we have to cut a lot of trainer cards from our deck, right? So we're running 2 Professor's Research, 2 Pokeball, which is something you should be doing in all of your decks. And then we're running just 1 Sabrina, 1 red card, and 1 potion. You can kind of mix these around, again, how you choose. I do think that this is the best version of this deck. I think that running 2 Sabrinas is perhaps better than the potion. But I do think that X speed is also required at a count of 2. The reason for this is because, again, you're not always going to start with Moltres in your active spot, and Charmander and Arcanine, or Charmander and Growlithe, both do have a retreat cost of 1, but you don't want to waste a turn having to attach to them and then retreating, right? You want to be able to retreat out for free and then attach to Moltres and get that energy acceleration happening in 1 turn. So I do think that X speed, in most decks, X speed is just extremely useful, but in this deck in particular, because getting that Moltres in the active spot as early as possible is extremely important. So I would always run 2 X speed in this deck. And then, yeah, so you have kind of 3 leftover cards, and Sabrina is really good, but the thing with Charizard is if you do get the Charizard set up with 5 or 6 energies, Sabrina just doesn't matter. It's not necessarily a win condition as often as you might think, because Charizard is probably going to take 1 hit from almost any Pokemon in the game, basically aside from other Charizards and a Blastoise EX that has, I think, 5 energies attached to it. Other than that, you're taking an attack from anything in the game. So Sabrina's not super important. If you have your Charizard fully set up at least early enough, you're just going to end up winning the game. So that's why I think 1 Sabrina in this deck is totally fine. You can run 2 Sabrinas. You could cut a red card, or you could cut the potion. Potion can be pretty good in the Pikachu matchup because, that chip damage does sort of add up, or against a Moltres deck, that extra kind of chip energy or chip damage that's going out onto your bench from the Articuno attack can be nice as well. So there's some matchups for sure where a potion is useful, but I actually like red card in this deck, and here's why. Because Charizard decks inherently take longer, right? They're longer decks to get set up, and the matches in which you play Charizard, take a little bit longer. And that's why red card's nice. So if you're going against other Charizard decks or a Venusaur deck or even a Mewtwo deck, a deck that kind of requires you to have a stage 1 and a stage 2 Pokemon to evolve into, red card's nice because basically you're increasing your odds of which a card might be in your opponent's hand that they're going to need next turn, and or also like a turn or 2 ahead. And that's, I think, why red card can be really good. So in a deck like this, where the games tend to go longer, cards tend to kind of pile up in your opponent's hand more often, a red card can be really good. And like I said, it is good in the mirror matchup. So this is how I prefer to run the deck, but I've tried it multiple different ways with 2 Sabrinas. I think 2 Sabrina is fine, but I think you should have probably at least 1 Sabrina. And I don't think Giovanni's needed in this deck. And the main reason for that is because Charizard is going to one-shot everything else. But the matchups in which you're not using Charizard, you have Arcanine for things like Pikachu, and Arcanine's going to one-hit KO mostly anything in those matchups as well. Now, 1 Giovanni could be nice just to KO things like Zapdos for 130 damage. Arcanine only does 120. But yeah, overall, it's not as needed as I think. I don't think Giovanni is necessarily that important in this deck list. This deck thrives in the late game, and you'll see in some matchups by the end of it, you just have an absolutely extreme amount of energies on your board, and it can be very fun and very dominant in the late game. You're also heavily protected a lot of times from things like a Dragonite sweep or your opponent playing Sabrina in the late game because you have so many Pokemon that all have high HP counts. Charizard has 180, Moltres has 140, so you can have 2 of those on your bench at one time, and then Arcanine has 150. So all of your Pokemon have a decent amount of HP, and none of them have super high retreat costs. So when it comes down to it, you're kind of protected in either way. You can kind of send up a Pokemon that has a lot of HP. It's very rare where you don't have an option like that. So that's typically not too much of an issue with this deck. Now, The thing that I like a lot about this deck is that it's unlike basically every other deck in Pokemon TCG Pocket, it doesn't have always one board state that you want to end up with, right? Every deck in Pokemon TCG Pocket is very, very linear, right? It's all about kind of achieving the same board state and then, from there sort of maneuvering and doing the right plays with what you have on your board. But every deck is kind of trying to set up the same way every game. This deck is a little bit different where you can kind of pick and choose where you want to invest your energies in based off of what your matchups are. And this is really, really cool. It's really fun, and it's a very sort of immersive gameplay experience compared to a lot of other decks in the format. For example, if you're going up against, a Mewtwo deck, you're not really going to choose to invest your energies and your time into an Arcanine because Arcanine is only doing 120 damage, and basically you're always going to be investing into Charizard because Mewtwo as well takes a long time to set up, and Charizard's just going to one-hit a Mewtwo, whereas Mewtwo can't one-hit Charizard, and that's really why inherently, especially over the last month or so, we've seen that Charizard has a positive matchup against Mewtwo. Those are the two most popular decks, right? So we're going to use that as sort of the measuring stick here. Mewtwo and Pikachu, those are the two most popular decks, and Charizard always had a pretty good matchup against Mewtwo. However, it had a bad matchup against Pikachu, whereas Arcanine EX with Moltres, if you were just playing a standalone Arcanine deck, that deck actually had a pretty decent matchup against Pikachu, and that's just because Arcanine, again, can take hits, whereas Pikachu can't take a hit from Arcanine. It's only a stage 1 Pokemon, as Charizard's a stage 2, and it only takes 3 energies to attack, whereas Charizard takes 4. So Arcanine, a much more kind of fast-paced, easier to set up card, and inherently is just much better in that Pikachu matchup. So it's really cool to have the best of both worlds. If you're going against a Mewtwo, you can choose to kind of attach your energies to your Charmander or your Charizard, whatever it may be on your bench with Moltres, or if you're going against Pikachu, you can attach those energies to your Growlithe. Now, one of the downsides is because we are only running one Growlithe, you don't always get it early in the game. I know we're running 2 Pokeballs, 2 Professor's Research, but we have 5 total basic Pokemon in the deck. So if you're not starting with Growlithe, for an example, let's just say you do start with Moltres, you have 4 other Pokemon in your deck, basically, if you're not drawing any more of them, right? You have 2 Charmanders, 1 more Moltres, and 1 Growlithe. So it's only a 1 in 4 chance per playing Pokeball to draw into that Growlithe. So it's not as consistent as you maybe would like, but again, it's still worth, only running 1 Growlithe. That way, we're starting with Moltres more often because that is the most consistent part of the deck. However, you could choose to cut a Moltres or cut a red card or cut a Sabrina and run 2 Growlithe, and that way you're kind of just increasing your odds of doing both. But again, it's sort of pick and choosy. This is sort of the deck list that we've seen to be the most successful, and I think it's because starting with Moltres should be the priority. So very, very interesting nonetheless. But yeah, this is a deck that I do enjoy playing. It's just different. It's a little bit different than the other decks in the format. And I'm actually really excited that this deck has sort of risen to prominence for a long time, at least for the first 3 or 4 weeks of Pokemon TCG Pocket being out. Everybody sort of accepted that Pikachu and Mewtwo were the only 2 decks that were really super viable when it came to maybe winning an online tournament or, kind of having a dominant experience in the ladder grind or the online random matches grind if you were just trying to get wins or, get experience or whatever it may be, right? Those were the 2 decks that everyone was playing, and Charizard was there, but it was very much on the outside where it didn't have a great matchup against Articuno. It didn't have a great matchup against Pikachu, but it was there and it was doing well against Mewtwo. Some people started to play Arcanine. In fact, Arcanine actually had won a tournament or 2 back a couple weeks ago. And then someone somewhere just sort of realized, I should remember the name of the person that first won with this deck, but I don't really know who was the first person to build a deck like this or play it. But either way, shout out to them because it's very interesting to see just how a deck like this, which seems like it would maybe be a little bit less consistent, ended up thriving just because you're expanding your positive matchups. Whereas, yes, the deck might not flow as consistent as just Charizard or just Arcanine, but it doesn't necessarily matter because you're not completely shutting yourself off in particular matchups. You're kind of opening yourself up. And this is something that other archetypes in the game aren't able to do very well, right? Pikachu decks, Mewtwo decks, even, Articuno, Starmie, and Misty decks, they don't have the option basically to combine with another archetype, another deck list to basically make a completely different deck. And I think that's really, really cool. So I absolutely love it. I love that this deck is popular now, and I love that it's winning so much, and I love that it's viable because it is a fun deck to play. And I do put this right now in the top 3 of the best decks in Pokemon TCG Pocket. I think right now it's firmly in 3rd place. Doesn't have as many people playing it as Pikachu and Mewtwo, and it probably never will because this deck does require a lot of EX Pokemon, so it's a kind of an expensive deck to play, and it's also perhaps maybe less consistent as Pikachu and Charizard. However, it is definitely the most powerful. So if you guys like the video, don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to stay tuned for more Pokemon TCG Pocket videos that will be coming in the future. I really appreciate it, guys. So thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you guys next time.